A woman noticed her elderly neighbor struggling with an old bicycle one morning. She decided to help him fix it, never knowing this simple act of kindness would lead to an unbelievable discovery that would change both their lives forever. What happened next left an entire community in tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rachel Collins lived in the weathered outskirts of Cedar Grove, a modest suburban neighborhood where most houses had seen better days, but where community spirit somehow managed to survive. Life hadn't been easy since losing her husband to a tragic accident 3 years ago, but she'd built a careful routine that kept her and her daughter Katie afloat. Every morning at 5:45 a.m., she'd wake up to prepare for her job as a waitress at Joe's Family Restaurant, where she'd been working double shifts whenever possible. The early morning quiet was her only moment of peace, watching the sun slowly paint the sky while sipping coffee from her chipped favorite mug. A Father's Day gift Katie had given her dad years ago. Their small 2-bedroom house wasn't much, but Rachel had learned to make it home. The garden, though small, burst with life. She'd planted vegetables to save on groceries, teaching Katie about self-sufficiency along the way. The garage doubled as her workspace, filled with tools she'd inherited from her father. Growing up helping in his repair shop had given her skills that proved invaluable now that she had to maintain everything herself. Every Sunday, she'd spend hours organizing those tools, each one holding memories of afternoons spent learning at her father's side. The smell of metal and oil always brought her back to simpler times. Cedar Grove was the kind of place where most people kept to themselves, not out of unfriendliness, but from the shared understanding that everyone was fighting their own battles. Rachel knew her neighbors' faces and exchanged polite waves, but rarely more than that. Sometimes she'd hear children playing in nearby yards or catch fragments of conversation floating through open windows, but mostly, the street maintained a respectful quiet. There was comfort in the predictability of her days. Wake up, get Katie ready for school, work her shift, help with homework, and start again the next day. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable, and stability was what they needed most. Katie, now 12, was growing into a thoughtful young woman who seemed to understand the weight her mother carried. She never complained about their modest lifestyle, or the fact that Rachel couldn't afford the latest gadgets her friends had. Instead, she'd taken to helping with the garden and even showed interest in learning basic repairs. Just like Mom, the neighbors would say when they saw her tinkering with her bicycle or helping to fix a broken fence. Rachel saw so much of her late husband in their daughter, the same determined set of her jaw, the same gentle way of moving through the world. Mr. Davidson had moved into the blue house next door about 6 months ago. He was a quiet man in his 70s who spent most mornings tending to his small garden. Rachel would often see him through her kitchen window, methodically watering his plants or sitting on his porch, looking at old photographs with a faraway expression. They'd never spoken beyond brief hellos, but there was something about his gentle demeanor that reminded her of her own father. She'd noticed how he always made sure to bring his newspaper in before the afternoon rain, how he'd leave birdseed out every morning, and how he seemed to take special care of an old wind chime that sang softly in the breeze. That Wednesday morning started like any other, with Rachel hurrying to her car, already thinking about the lunch rush ahead. The air was crisp with early autumn, leaves beginning to turn golden at their edges. But something made her pause. Mr. Davidson was standing in his driveway, staring at an old bicycle with a look of distress that seemed out of proportion for such a simple thing. The bike was propped against his garage wall, its chain hanging loose, one pedal barely attached. The morning light caught the faded blue paint, revealing patches of rust that spoke of years of neglect. Rachel checked her watch. She had 20 minutes before her shift started. Usually, she'd use that time to grab a coffee from the gas station, her one small luxury of the day. She hesitated, one hand on her car door. The image of Mr. Davidson's worried face tugged at something inside her. It wasn't just about the bike, there was a story there, something in the way he kept running his hand along the handlebars, almost reverently. His fingers trembled slightly as they traced the old bell, still attached despite the years. "Everything okay, Mr. Davidson?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. He turned, startled, as if he'd been lost in thought. "Oh, good morning, Rachel." His voice carried a slight tremor. "It's this old bike. It belonged to my late wife. I was hoping to fix it up for my granddaughter Emma, who's coming to visit next week. But I'm afraid my hands aren't what they used to be." He gestured to his slightly shaking fingers, a mix of embarrassment and resignation on his face. The morning sun caught the wedding ring he still wore, a golden reminder of a life shared. Rachel glanced at her watch again. "The coffee would have to wait. I could take a look if you'd like. I learned a thing or two about bikes from my dad." As she spoke, memories of Saturday afternoons spent in her father's shop flooded back. The sound of tools clicking against metal, the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. The hope that flickered across Mr. Davidson's face made her glad she'd stopped. As she walked toward the bike, rolling up her sleeves, Rachel had no way of knowing that this simple offer of help would set in motion events that would transform not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, and on that ordinary Wednesday morning, Rachel Collins made a choice that would prove extraordinary in ways she could never have imagined. The old bicycle looked worse up close. Years of neglect had left their mark. Rust crept along the frame, the chain was completely seized, and both tires were flat and cracking. But beneath the wear and tear, Rachel could see it had once been a beautiful machine. It was a vintage Schwinn, probably from the 1960s, with delicate chrome details that still caught the morning light despite their tarnish. "My Alice used to ride this every day," Mr. Davidson said softly, his voice thick with memory. "She'd take it down to the library where she worked with a basket full of books." He touched the spot where the basket had once been mounted, now just a few empty brackets. "She always said there was nothing better than feeling the wind in her hair." Rachel knelt beside the bike, her practiced eyes assessing the damage. The pedal would be an easy fix, just a matter of tightening the crank arm. The chain would need more work, but she had some degreaser at home that might help. The tires would have to be replaced entirely. "I think I can help," she said, standing up and brushing off her hands. "It'll take some time, but we can get her running again." Mr. Davidson's eyes brightened. "You really think so?" "Emma, my granddaughter, she's just turned 12. Alice would have loved to see her riding it." He paused, seeming to remember something. "But you must have work. I didn't mean to keep you." Rachel checked her watch again. She was definitely going to be late now. "Let me make a quick call." She stepped away and dialed the restaurant. "Hey, Sandy? Something's come up. Could you cover the first hour of my shift? I'll stay late to make up for it." Sandy, who had covered for Rachel countless times before, agreed without hesitation. Returning to her garage, Rachel gathered the tools she'd need. Katie appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, curious about the delay in their morning routine. "Mom? What's going on?" "Change of plans, sweetheart. Can you catch the bus today? I'm helping Mr. Davidson with something important." Katie nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd inherited her mother's sense of responsibility, along with her father's kindness. For the next hour, Rachel worked steadily on the bicycle. Mr. Davidson pulled up a lawn chair to watch, occasionally sharing stories about Alice, how they'd met at a dance in 1965, how she'd taught English at the local high school before moving to the library, how she'd kept riding this very bike until her health began to fail 5 years ago. As Rachel worked the seized chain free, link by link, she learned about Emma, the granddaughter who was coming to stay while her parents sorted out what Mr. Davidson called adult problems. The way his voice caught when he mentioned it made Rachel suspect there was more to the story, but she didn't press. The morning grew warmer as Rachel tackled each problem. She had to improvise some solutions, using parts from her daughter's old bike that she'd kept in the garage, carefully cleaning and adjusting each component. Mr. Davidson insisted on helping despite his arthritis, holding tools and pointing out spots she might have missed. "Alice always noticed the details," he said, indicating a small heart carved into the frame near the seat post. "She put that there the day we bought it, said it made it officially hers." His fingers traced the faded marking with tender familiarity. Rachel worked methodically, the familiar motions bringing back memories of working alongside her father. He'd taught her that fixing things wasn't just about the mechanics. It was about restoring history, preserving memories. As she polished the chrome handlebars, she could almost hear his voice. "Take your time, Rachie. Every scratch tells a story." The neighborhood began to wake up around them. Mrs. Bennett from across the street brought over coffee and muffins, curious about the activity. She listened to Mr. Davidson's stories about Alice, adding her own memories of seeing her ride past with her book basket. Word seemed to spread, and by mid-morning, several neighbors had stopped by to watch the restoration in progress. Finally, after replacing the tires with the spares from Katie's old bike, Rachel stood back to survey her work. And the bicycle wasn't perfect. The paint was still faded and some rust spots remained. But it was solid, safe, and most importantly, rideable. The chain moved smoothly now, and the pedals turned without a sound. "Would you like to try it?" she asked Mr. Davidson. He shook his head, eyes glistening. "I think we should wait for Emma," he said softly. "She should be the first one to ride it now." He reached for his wallet, but Rachel quickly shook her head. "Please don't. This was—" She paused, searching for the right words. This was a pleasure, really. And it had been. There was something deeply satisfying about bringing this piece of history back to life, about helping to preserve these memories for a new generation. Mr. Davidson looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you, Rachel. You don't know what this means." There was something in his voice, a weight to his words that seemed to carry more meaning than the situation warranted. But before Rachel could puzzle it out, he had turned away, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As Rachel finally headed to work, now several hours late but somehow feeling lighter than she had in weeks, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. It wasn't just about fixing a bicycle. It was about connecting with someone else's story, becoming part of something larger than herself. Little did she know, this morning's act of kindness was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about community, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways that lives can intertwine. Over the next few days, Rachel found herself thinking often about Mr. Davidson and the bicycle. She'd catch glimpses of it through her kitchen window, now propped proudly against the porch railing instead of hidden away in the garage. Each morning, she noticed Mr. Davidson polishing it slightly, as if counting down the days until Emma's arrival. The weekend arrived with an unseasonable warmth, and Rachel was pruning her garden when she heard the sound of a car door closing next door. Looking up, she saw Mr. Davidson hurrying down his driveway toward a taxi. From the back seat emerged a young girl with sandy blonde hair, wearing a backpack that seemed too big for her slight frame. Emma, Rachel realized, had arrived. The girl moved cautiously, almost hesitantly, as her grandfather embraced her. There was something in her demeanor that tugged at Rachel's heart, a wariness that seemed out of place in someone so young. As Mr. Davidson led Emma toward the house, he caught Rachel's eye and gave a small wave, pride and worry mingling on his face. Later that afternoon, while Rachel was preparing dinner, she heard the unmistakable sound of childish laughter floating through her open window. Glancing out, she saw Emma on the restored bicycle, making slow circles in Mr. Davidson's driveway. The old man stood watching, his hands clasped together, joy evident in every line of his face. "Mom, can I go outside?" Katie asked, having heard the laughter too. Rachel nodded, understanding her daughter's curiosity about the new arrival. Through the window, she watched as Katie approached Emma, admiring the bike. Within minutes, the girls were chatting animatedly, as only 12-year-olds can. That evening, a knock at the door surprised Rachel. She opened it to find Mr. Davidson standing there, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Emma's asleep," he said quietly. She was so excited about the bike, she wore herself out. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Rachel, I need to tell you something," May I come in? Rachel led him to the kitchen, where a pot of coffee was still warm. As she poured 2 cups, Mr. Davidson carefully placed the package on the table between them. His hands trembled more than usual as he unwrapped it, revealing an old, leather-bound photo album. "I wanted you to understand why fixing that bicycle meant so much," he began, opening the album. "You see, Emma's parents, my son David and his wife, they're going through more than just adult problems. David's been struggling with addiction for years. His wife left last month and he's finally agreed to get help, but he trailed off, his fingers tracing the edge of a photograph showing a younger version of himself with a small boy. Emma's staying with me while David's in rehabilitation. She's had it rough, harder than any child should." Mr. Davidson's voice cracked slightly. "That bicycle? It wasn't just about the memories of Alice. It was about giving Emma something stable, something that connects her to family history, to happier times." Rachel felt her throat tighten as Mr. Davidson turned another page, revealing a photo of a young woman on the same blue bicycle, her hair catching the sunlight, a basket of books on the handlebars. "Alice always said that bicycles represented freedom," he continued. "Freedom to explore, to dream, to escape when things got hard. I thought maybe it could do the same for Emma." As Mr. Davidson shared more about his family's struggles, Rachel found herself opening up too, about losing her husband, about the challenges of raising Katie alone, about the constant worry of making ends meet. The kitchen grew darker as they talked, but neither moved to turn on the lights, as if the dimness made it easier to share these painful truths. "Rachel," Mr. Davidson said finally, closing the album, "I have a favor to ask. Emma's going to need more than just her old grandfather while she's here. She needs friends, stability, and good influences. I've seen how kind Katie is, how responsible. Would you mind if Emma spent time here sometimes? I'd pay you for any trouble." "Of course she can spend time here," Rachel interrupted gently. "No payment needed. That's what neighbors are for." The relief on Mr. Davidson's face made her heart ache. Here was a man carrying so much on his shoulders, trying his best to create a safe haven for a wounded child. As she walked him to the door later, Rachel realized that fixing the bicycle had been more than just a random act of kindness. It had opened a door, created a connection that might prove vital for both families. Standing in her doorway, watching Mr. Davidson's slightly stooped figure make his way home through the gathering darkness, she felt a fierce determination to help however she could. Little did Rachel know that this evening's revelations were just the beginning. The true test of her commitment, and the unexpected miracle that would change all their lives, was still to come. Sometimes the universe has a way of bringing people together exactly when they need each other most, and in the quiet suburban streets of Cedar Grove, a remarkable story of hope, healing, and community was about to unfold. The following weeks brought changes to both households as Emma became a regular presence in Rachel's home. The once quiet girl slowly began to emerge from her shell, especially around Katie. They'd spend afternoons doing homework at Rachel's kitchen table, their heads bent together over textbooks or riding their bikes around the neighborhood. Emma on Alice's restored Schwinn, Katie on her newer model. Rachel noticed how Emma would sometimes fall silent, her eyes distant, particularly when her phone would buzz with messages she'd quickly delete. During these moments, Katie seemed to instinctively know how to draw her friend back, sharing a joke or suggesting they work on their science project. It reminded Rachel so much of how her late husband used to handle difficult situations, with quiet understanding and gentle distraction. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as Rachel was preparing dinner with both girls helping in the kitchen, she overheard a conversation that made her heart skip a beat. Emma was chopping carrots while Katie stirred the soup simmering on the stove. "My dad's supposed to call today," Emma said quietly, her knife slowing its rhythm. "He hasn't called in 2 weeks." The carrot she was cutting rolled off the board, but she didn't move to retrieve it. "Maybe he's really busy with getting better," Katie offered, showing wisdom beyond her years. "Mom says sometimes people need to focus completely on healing." Rachel pretended to be absorbed in checking the recipe, but her ears strained to catch every word. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mr. Davidson in his garden, methodically pulling weeds despite the drizzle, his shoulders more stooped than usual. Grandpa tries to hide it, but I know he's worried, Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard him talking on the phone last night about medical bills. He thought I was asleep. She paused, then added even more quietly, He's been coughing a lot lately. He thinks I don't notice, but I do. Rachel's hand froze over the spice rack. She'd noticed it too. The persistent cough Mr. Davidson tried to muffle behind his hand. The way he had to stop and catch his breath after even minor exertion. She'd attributed it to the changing weather, but now a seed of worry took root in her mind. Later that evening, after Katie had gone to bed, Rachel sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the lights in Mr. Davidson's house. She could see his silhouette moving about, pausing occasionally to lean against something for support. The sight triggered a memory of her husband in his final months trying to hide his own weakness, wanting to appear strong for his family. The next morning, Rachel made a decision. After sending the girls off to school, she walked next door and knocked. Mr. Davidson answered, looking tired but managing a smile. Rachel, what a pleasant surprise. Mr. Davidson, she began, then corrected herself. James, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've noticed your cough. Have you had it checked out? The smile faded from his face, replaced by something more complex. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. He invited her in, and over coffee, the truth came out. He'd been experiencing symptoms for months, but had avoided seeing a doctor. With Emma's father's rehabilitation costs, his own medical bills from a minor surgery last year, and the general expenses of raising a granddaughter, he couldn't afford more medical bills. I'm sure it's nothing, he insisted, but his eyes told a different story. Emma needs stability right now. I can't. He trailed off, staring into his coffee cup. Rachel felt a familiar determination rising within her, the same feeling she'd had when facing challenges after her husband's death. You need to see a doctor, she said firmly. Emma needs you to be healthy. We'll figure out the rest. Mr. Davidson looked up, started to protest, but was interrupted by a coughing fit that left him breathless. When he could speak again, his voice was rough. Rachel, you've already done so much. That bicycle. You don't know what it meant to Emma, to me. But this is too much to ask. You're not asking, Rachel replied, reaching across the table to pat his hand. I'm offering. We're neighbors, remember? More than that now, I'd say we're friends. Let me make some calls at least. I know a nurse at Cedar Grove Medical Center. Maybe she can help us figure out our options. As she spoke, Rachel was already mentally calculating her savings, wondering if she could pick up extra shifts at the restaurant. It wouldn't be easy, but seeing Mr. Davidson's obvious illness stirred something deep within her. Memories of feeling helpless as her husband's health declined, of wishing she could have done more. What Rachel didn't know then was that her determination to help would set off a chain of events that would not only change Mr. Davidson's life, but would bring their entire community together in ways she never could have imagined. Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come not from having much to give, but from being willing to give what little we have. And in Cedar Grove, that spirit of giving was about to create something extraordinary. The following Monday, Rachel sat nervously in the waiting room of Cedar Grove Medical Center while Mr. Davidson met with Dr. Morgan. She'd managed to get him an appointment through her contact, a nurse named Linda who'd helped care for her husband. The hall still held difficult memories, but Rachel pushed them aside, focusing instead on the magazines in her lap that she wasn't really reading. After what seemed like hours, Mr. Davidson emerged, looking pale. Dr. Morgan followed, gesturing for Rachel to join them in his office. The doctor's expression was serious as he closed the door behind them. Mr. Davidson has agreed that I can discuss this with you, Ms. Collins, Dr. Morgan began, shuffling through some papers on his desk. We've found some concerning issues in his lungs that require immediate attention. The tests indicate early-stage lung cancer, but he held up a hand as Rachel gasped. We've caught it relatively early. There's a good chance of recovery with proper treatment. Rachel reached over and squeezed Mr. Davidson's hand. He sat motionless, staring at a point on the wall, his face ashen. The treatment plan I'm recommending includes surgery followed by targeted radiation therapy, Dr. Morgan continued. The success rates are quite good, but… He paused, glancing at Mr. Davidson. But I can't afford it, Mr. Davidson finished quietly. Not with David's rehabilitation costs, not with Emma's needs. I just can't. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Dr. Morgan leaned forward, his expression compassionate. There are programs we can look into, payment plans we can discuss. But Mr. Davidson, I need to be clear. Without treatment, your condition will worsen rapidly. Time is a factor here. The drive home was silent, heavy with unspoken words. Rachel's mind raced, calculating numbers that refused to add up. As they pulled into Mr. Davidson's driveway, he finally spoke. Please don't tell Emma. She's been through enough already. Her father's situation, her mother leaving, she doesn't need this too. Rachel watched him slowly make his way to his front door, each step seeming to age him further. That evening, unable to sleep, she sat at her kitchen table with a stack of papers, medical pamphlets, insurance forms, her own bank statements. The numbers blurred before her eyes, but one thing was clear. Something had to be done. The next morning, Rachel called in sick to work for the first time in years. She spent the day making calls, to insurance companies, to medical assistance programs, to local charities. Each conversation ended the same way. There was help available, but not enough. The gap between what Mr. Davidson could afford and what he needed was still too wide. As she was about to give up for the day, her phone rang. It was Mike Stevens, the owner of the local bike shop. Word had gotten around about her fixing Alice's old bicycle, and he'd been impressed by her handiwork. Rachel, he said, I heard about Mr. Davidson's situation. Listen, I've got an idea. Mike explained that he'd been looking for someone to help in his shop part-time, specifically someone who could restore vintage bikes. There's a growing market for it, he said, and from what I've seen of your work, you've got the touch. It would be evenings after your restaurant shift. The pay's decent, and more importantly, it's steady. Rachel felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't enough to cover Mr. Davidson's medical bills, but it was something. She accepted immediately, even as her mind whirled with questions about how she'd manage the extra hours, how Katie would handle having her mom away even more. That evening, as Rachel shared the news about the job with Katie, her daughter surprised her. Mom, what if we did more? What if we had a fundraiser, like a big community bike repair day? You could teach people basic repairs and they could donate money to help Mr. Davidson. Rachel stared at her daughter, amazed by her insight and compassion. The idea began to take shape in her mind. Not just a fundraiser, but a way to bring the community together. She thought about all the neighbors who'd stopped by to watch her fix Alice's bicycle, about the stories Mr. Davidson had shared, about the way Emma's presence had already touched so many lives in their neighborhood. As she tucked Katie into bed that night, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Pure, unshakable determination. Tomorrow she will start spreading the word. She would talk to Mike about hosting the event at his shop, reach out to her contacts at the restaurant for catering, and ask Mrs. Bennett to help organize. This wasn't just about raising money anymore, it was about showing Mr. Davidson and Emma that they weren't alone. What Rachel didn't realize was that her plan would spark something much larger than she imagined. In the coming days, Cedar Grove would reveal its heart in ways that would astonish everyone, proving that sometimes the greatest miracles come not from single grand gestures, but from countless small acts of kindness woven together into something extraordinary. The idea of the fundraiser took off like wildfire through Cedar Grove. What started as a simple bike repair day quickly evolved into something much bigger as neighbors began stepping forward with their own suggestions and offers to help. Mike Stevens didn't just offer his shop. He announced he would donate 50% of all his sales during the event. Mrs. Bennett transformed from a quiet neighbor into an unstoppable force, coordinating volunteers and spreading the word through her extensive church network. But it was the unexpected call from the local newspaper that changed everything. "Ms. Collins?" The reporter's voice crackled through Rachel's phone one evening. "I heard about what you're doing for Mr. Davidson. We'd like to run a story. Community rallies around local grandfather. Would you be willing to talk to us?" Rachel hesitated, glancing through her window at Mr. Davidson's house. His condition had deteriorated noticeably in the past week, his cough becoming more frequent, his walks in the garden shorter. Emma had started doing most of the weeding herself, her small hands working determinedly while throwing worried glances at her grandfather's window. "I'll do the interview," Rachel decided, "but only if you focus on the fundraiser, not me. This isn't about one person. It's about an entire community coming together." The article appeared 3 days later, and the response was overwhelming. People started showing up at Rachel's door, strangers with old bikes needing repair, willing to pay for her services, with all proceeds going to Mr. Davidson's medical fund. Her garage became a makeshift repair shop, with Katie and Emma helping to organize tools and parts after school. One evening, as Rachel worked on her third bike of the day, she heard Emma's voice from the doorway. "Can you teach me?" the girl asked quietly. "About fixing bikes, I mean. I want to help too." Rachel looked up, wiping grease from her hands. Emma stood there looking so much like the photo of her grandmother, Alice, the same determined set of her jaw, the same spark in her eyes. "Of course," Rachel smiled, patting the workbench beside her. "Your grandmother would be proud." As they worked together, Emma opened up about her father. "He called yesterday," she said, carefully oiling a bike chain the way Rachel had shown her. "He sounds different, better. He asked about the bicycle, Grandma's bicycle. He remembered her riding it when he was my age." Rachel listened, noting how Emma's voice grew stronger as she spoke. The girl who had arrived just weeks ago, withdrawn and wary, was slowly being replaced by someone more confident, more hopeful. "Sometimes," Emma continued, "when I'm riding it, I pretend she's with me. Is that weird?" "Not at all," Rachel replied, thinking of her own husband, how she still felt his presence in certain moments. "That's how we keep the people we love close to us." The day of the fundraiser dawned bright and clear. Rachel arrived at Mike's shop early to find a line already forming, people with bikes in various states of disrepair, others simply carrying checkbooks or cash donations. Mrs. Bennett had transformed the parking lot into a festival space with food stands, music, and a photo display of old Cedar Grove featuring several shots of Alice on her beloved bicycle. But it was the sight of Mr. Davidson that brought tears to Rachel's eyes. He stood near the entrance, Emma by his side, greeting each person who came to support him. His eyes were red-rimmed, his handshake trembling, but his smile was genuine. Community members who had never spoken to him before were now embracing him, sharing stories of how Alice had touched their lives, how her kindness had rippled through Cedar Grove in ways no one had realized. The most surprising moment came when Rachel's phone rang mid-afternoon. It was David, Emma's father, calling from rehabilitation. "I saw the newspaper article," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you're doing for my father, for Emma. I don't have words, but it's helping me too, knowing they're not alone. It's giving me more strength to get better, to be the father Emma deserves." As the day progressed, the crowd grew larger. Local businesses began calling in pledges. The high school cycling team showed up en masse, offering free basic bike maintenance lessons. Even Dr. Morgan appeared, pulling Rachel aside with news about a medical assistance program that, combined with the fundraiser proceeds, might just cover Mr. Davidson's treatment. But the most powerful moment came when Emma wheeled out her grandmother's restored bicycle, now decorated with streamers and a new basket. "I'm going to ride in honor of Grandma Alice," she announced to the crowd. $1 pledged for each lap around the block. Who's with me?" The response was immediate. Other children brought out their bikes, Parents reached for their wallets, and soon a parade of cyclists was following Emma, her grandfather watching with tears streaming down his face as his granddaughter led the way on Alice's beloved bicycle. Standing there, watching the scene unfold, Rachel felt something shift in her understanding of community, of healing, of hope. This wasn't just about saving one man's life anymore. It was about rediscovering the connections that bound them all together, the invisible threads of compassion and kindness that could transform ordinary streets into something extraordinary. The success of the fundraiser exceeded everyone's expectations. By sunset, the donation total had reached a staggering amount, though still not quite enough for Mr. Davidson's complete treatment plan. However, something even more valuable had emerged. A renewed sense of purpose in Cedar Grove, a community awakened to its own potential for kindness. As Rachel helped Mike close up the shop that evening, exhausted but satisfied, he pulled her aside with an unexpected proposition. "I've been thinking," he said, arranging tools with practiced precision. "That job offer I made you? I'd like to expand it. Full-time position, running our new vintage restoration department. The response today showed there's real demand for this kind of work." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. The salary he mentioned was significantly more than what she made at the diner, and the hours would be more compatible with Katie's school schedule. But before she could respond, Mike continued, "Plus, I want to set up a permanent donation program, a percentage of each restoration job going to help families in need, starting with Mr. Davidson's ongoing medical expenses." That night, as Rachel sat in her kitchen processing the day's events, she heard a soft knock at her back door. It was Emma, still buzzing with energy despite the late hour. "Can I show you something?" she asked, clutching a worn notebook to her chest. "It's important." Rachel followed her next door, where Mr. Davidson sat in his armchair looking both exhausted and somehow lighter than he had in weeks. Emma opened the notebook, revealing pages of calculations and lists. "I've been keeping track of everything," she explained, her voice trembling with excitement. "The donations, the pledges, Dad's new job at the rehabilitation center." "New job?" Rachel asked, surprised. Mr. Davidson nodded, his eyes glistening. "David called during the fundraiser. He's been offered a position helping other patients at the center once he completes his program. It's not much, but it's a start. He wants to contribute to my medical expenses." Emma continued flipping through her notebook. "And look, if Dad helps, and with your new job at the bike shop, and the monthly donations Mike promised." Her fingers traced down columns of careful numbers. "We're so close, Mrs. Collins. So close to having enough for Grandpa's full treatment." Rachel studied the pages, impressed by Emma's meticulous calculations. The girl had thought of everything, even factoring in potential garage sale proceeds from clearing out their attic. But what caught Rachel's eye was a separate list in the margin: ways to thank Mrs. Collins. The items ranged from practical, clean her garage, to ambitious, find her a new husband or Santiago. This one crossed out with multiple lines. "Emma," Rachel began, her throat tight with emotion, but she was interrupted by another coughing fit from Mr. Davidson. This one was worse than usual, leaving him gasping for breath, his face alarmingly pale. Without hesitation, Rachel called Dr. Morgan's emergency number. Within minutes, she was helping Mr. Davidson to her car while Emma ran to get his medications and overnight bag. They'd prepared one just in case, though they'd hoped never to need it. The drive to the hospital was tense. Emma sat in the back seat, clutching her notebook like a lifeline, while Mr. Davidson tried to maintain a brave face despite his obvious distress. Rachel caught glimpses of them in her rearview mirror, grandfather and granddaughter, both trying so hard to be strong for each other. In the emergency room, as they waited for news, Rachel held Emma's hand while texting Katie updates. The waiting room slowly filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Bennett arrived with thermoses of coffee and sandwiches. Mike came straight from closing the shop, and even Dr. Morgan stopped by on his way home to check on his patient personally. Around midnight, the emergency room doctor finally emerged with news. Mr. Davidson's condition had stabilized, but the incident had made one thing clear: they couldn't afford to wait any longer for treatment. As Rachel listened to the doctor's explanation, She felt Emma's hand tighten in hers. That's when Mrs. Bennet stepped forward, her usually quiet voice surprisingly firm. "I have an announcement to make," she said, looking around the small gathering. "I've been doing some thinking and some praying and, well, I'm selling my vacation property up at the lake. I've already spoken to my realtor. The proceeds should cover whatever gap is left in Mr. Davidson's medical fund." The room erupted in protests. Everyone knew how much that lake house meant to Mrs. Bennet, how she'd been planning to retire there. But she held up her hand, silencing them all. "James and Alice Davidson were there for me when I lost my Harold," she said quietly. "They brought me meals, checked on me every day, made sure I wasn't alone. Some debts can never be repaid, but some debts shouldn't be." Rachel watched as Emma processed this news, saw the moment when the girl realized what it meant. Her grandfather would get the treatment he needed. The expression that crossed her face was one Rachel recognized from her own mirror years ago. The look of someone discovering that even in the darkest times, light could break through in the most unexpected ways. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Mr. Davidson was admitted to the hospital to begin his treatment immediately, and the entire community mobilized to support both him and Emma. A schedule was created, coordinated by Mrs. Bennet, of course, ensuring that someone was always with Mr. Davidson during visiting hours while others took turns caring for Emma. Rachel converted her home office into a temporary bedroom for Emma, though the girl spent most nights curled up in Katie's room anyway, their whispered conversations lasting well into the night. During the day, while Rachel worked at Mike's shop, the girls would do their homework at a small desk he'd set up in the corner, occasionally helping with simple repair tasks when business was slow. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into Mr. Davidson's treatment, Rachel received an unexpected call from David, Emma's father. His voice was stronger than she remembered, more assured. "I'm completing the program next week," he said. "They've offered me a full-time position here helping other patients, but I need to ask you something important." Rachel listened as David explained his situation. The job would require him to stay at the rehabilitation center for extended periods, making it impossible to care for Emma full-time. "I've been talking with Dad," he continued, "and we were wondering, would you consider becoming Emma's legal guardian while I get established in my new role? You've already done so much, I hate to ask for more, but—" "Yes," Rachel interrupted, watching through the shop window as Emma taught Katie how to true a bicycle wheel, their heads bent together in concentration. "Of course, yes." The paperwork was filed the following week, with Mr. Davidson signing his approval from his hospital bed. His condition had stabilized, though the treatment left him exhausted. Still, his eyes brightened every time Emma visited, especially when she brought photos of her latest bike restoration projects. Rachel had given Emma her own set of basic tools, and the girl had taken to the work with natural talent. "Just like her grandmother," Mr. Davidson would say proudly, watching videos on Rachel's phone of Emma working in the shop. The vintage bicycle restoration business was thriving, with Emma and Katie becoming unofficial apprentices after school. One particular Thursday evening, as Rachel was closing up the shop, she found Emma sitting quietly beside Alice's restored bicycle, which they'd moved to the shop as a display piece. "I had a dream about her last night," Emma said without looking up. "Grandma Alice, I mean. She was riding this bike, but she wasn't alone. There was this whole group of people with her, all on different bikes like a parade. And everyone was smiling, even Dad and Grandpa." Rachel sat down beside her, noting how much healthier and happier Emma looked compared to when she'd first arrived in Cedar Grove. "That sounds like a beautiful dream." "It wasn't just a dream," Emma replied, her voice thoughtful. "It was like what's happening now. All these people coming together, helping each other. Like when you fixed this bike, you weren't just fixing a bike. You were fixing us too." That night, Rachel lay awake thinking about Emma's words. The past few weeks had transformed their lives in ways she never could have imagined. Her new job at the bike shop provided not just financial stability, but a sense of purpose she'd been missing since her husband's death. Katie had blossomed with Emma's presence, showing a maturity and compassion that made Rachel's heart swell with pride. Mr. Davidson's prognosis was improving daily, thanks to the aggressive treatment they could now afford. Maybe even start that scholarship program we talked about, for kids interested in learning the trade. As Rachel processed this news, she heard the familiar sound of bicycle bells. Outside, Emma and Katie were arriving on their bikes, with Mrs. Bennett following on a recently restored cruiser. Her first bike in 30 years, she'd proudly announced. They were laughing, their faces bright in the morning sun. Rachel thought about how a simple act of kindness, stopping to help fix a bicycle, had set off a chain reaction that was still creating ripples through their community. She thought about Emma's dream, about Alice's spirit living on through more than just her restored bicycle, about how healing happened not just in hospitals, but in the connections forged between people. 6 months after the fundraiser, Cedar Grove was transformed. Mike's bike shop, now officially renamed Davidson and Collins Vintage Restorations, had become a community hub. The front window displayed Alice's blue Schwinn prominently, surrounded by photos of other restored bikes and their stories. But the real transformation wasn't in the bicycles, it was in the people. Mr. Davidson's final treatment session was scheduled for the following week, and his doctors were optimistic. The cancer had responded well to treatment, shrinking significantly. Though still weak, he had begun taking short walks in the hospital garden, and his cough had almost disappeared. But it was the change in his spirit that was most remarkable. He spoke constantly of future plans, of teaching Emma to garden, of helping David furnish his new apartment near the rehabilitation center. One crisp autumn morning, as Rachel was organizing the shop's new apprenticeship program paperwork, she received an unexpected call from David. "Can you gather everyone at the hospital this afternoon?" he asked, his voice vibrating with suppressed excitement. "I have some news, and Dad should hear it first, but I want everyone there." Rachel spent the next hour making calls. Soon, a small crowd had assembled in Mr. Davidson's hospital room. Rachel, Emma, Katie, Mrs. Bennett, Mike, and several other neighbors who'd become like family over the past months. David arrived last, carrying a thick envelope and wearing an expression Rachel had never seen before. Pure, untainted joy. "I'm 1 year sober today," he announced, his voice steady. "And I've been offered a position as the head counselor at the rehabilitation center." He paused, looking around the room. "But that's not all. The center is opening a new facility, right here in Cedar Grove. They want me to run it." The room erupted in congratulations, but David held up his hand. "There's more. The new facility will have a special program inspired by what happened here. We're calling it the Bicycle Theory, using mechanical restoration work as therapy. Mike has already agreed to partner with us." He turned to his father, who was sitting up straighter in his hospital bed than Rachel had seen in months. "Dad, they want to name the workshop after Mom, the Alice Davidson Memorial Workshop." Mr. Davidson's eyes filled with tears as David continued, "And the best part? I've found a house just 3 blocks from yours. Emma can split her time between both homes, stay in her school, keep working at the bike shop." He looked at Rachel. "If that's okay with her guardian, of course." Emma, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly launched herself at her father, wrapping him in a fierce hug. "Really? You're really staying?" Rachel watched the scene unfold, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that always came with moments of pure happiness, the wish that her husband could be here to see it. But somehow, the ache was different now, softer, more bittersweet than painful. Later that afternoon, as the excitement settled, Rachel found herself alone with Mr. Davidson. The others had gone to the cafeteria, leaving them in a comfortable silence. "You know," he said finally, "when Alice was sick, she made me promise to keep her bicycle. Said it would be important someday. I never understood why until now." He reached for a small box beside his bed, hands steady as he opened it. Inside was a key with a small heart keychain, the same heart that was carved into the bicycle's frame. "Alice would want you to have this," he said, pressing it into Rachel's hand. "It's to the shed behind our house. There's something there you should see." That evening, after everyone had gone home, Rachel used the key. The shed was small but meticulously organized. On one wall hung an array of vintage bicycle tools, each cleaned and oiled. Below them sat boxes of parts, carefully labeled in Alice's handwriting. But it was the envelope on the workbench that caught Rachel's eye, addressed simply to the person who fixes things. Inside, Rachel found a letter written years ago. Alice's words, flowing across the page in elegant script, told of her love for bicycles, for the freedom they represented, for the way fixing them had taught her about fixing other things in life. The letter ended with a request. If you're reading this, you've probably already discovered that sometimes the things most in need of repair aren't the things we can see. Keep fixing, keep helping, keep believing in the magic of second chances. Rachel sat in the shed for a long time, surrounded by Alice's tools and memories, thinking about second chances. She thought about Mr. Davidson, fighting his way back to health, about David, rebuilding his life, about Emma, finding her strength, about herself, discovering a new purpose. Sometimes the biggest repairs started with the smallest tools: a kind word, a helping hand, a willingness to stop and fix what was broken. 1 year to the day after Rachel first stopped to help fix an old bicycle, Cedar Grove celebrated. The occasion was threefold: Mr. Davidson's official clean bill of health, the grand opening of the new rehabilitation center with its Alice Davidson Memorial Workshop, and the first graduation ceremony of Davidson and Collins Vintage Restoration's apprenticeship program. The celebration took place in the community park, now adorned with bike racks that Mike's shop had restored and donated. Alice's blue Schwinn held the place of honor, decorated with flowers and surrounded by photographs chronicling the year's journey. The transformation was visible not just in the pictures, but in the faces of everyone present. Mr. Davidson stood tall beside the bicycle, his color healthy, his smile bright as he addressed the gathered crowd. "A year ago," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I was a man drowning in worry, trying to be strong for my granddaughter while hiding my own illness. I thought I had to carry everything alone." He paused, looking around at the faces before him. I couldn't have been more wrong. Emma sat in the front row between David and Rachel, clutching her toolbox, a graduation gift from Mike engraved with her name and master restorer in training. She'd spent the past year learning every aspect of bicycle restoration, showing a natural talent that surprised no one who knew her grandmother's story. "When my wife Alice used to ride through these streets," Mr. Davidson continued, "she always said that a bicycle was more than just parts and pieces. It was a possibility, hope, connection. I never fully understood what she meant until this past year, when one simple act of kindness set in motion a chain of events that would save not just my life, but our entire family." Rachel listened from her place beside Katie, remembering that morning, a year ago when she'd stopped to help, how close she'd come to driving past, to staying within the safe confines of her routine. Her daughter squeezed her hand, somehow knowing where her thoughts had gone. David stood to speak next, his voice steady as he shared his journey from addiction to recovery to purpose. The new rehabilitation center had already accepted its first group of participants, each one assigned a vintage bicycle to restore alongside their personal restoration. "Every broken thing deserves a chance to be whole again," he said, echoing words from Alice's letter, which now hung framed in the workshop. The ceremony continued, with Emma presenting restoration certificates to the first class of young apprentices, teenagers from the community who'd spent months learning the trade. Each one had a story: the shy boy who'd found his confidence alongside a 1950s Raleigh, the girl from the foster system who discovered she had a gift for detailed work, the brothers who turned their grief over losing their mother into something positive. As the official ceremonies concluded, Rachel took the microphone for one final announcement. "A year ago, I thought I was just fixing a bicycle," she began. "I didn't realize I was actually becoming part of a story that began long before me, with a woman who believed in the power of repair, not just of things, but of people, of communities, of hope itself." She unveiled a sign that had been covered throughout the ceremony: the Alice Davidson Scholarship Fund for Future Restorers. fund, created from a portion of the shop's profits and community donations, would ensure that anyone who wanted to learn the trade could do so, regardless of their circumstances. The celebration continued into the evening. Children rode decorated bikes in impromptu parades, families shared potluck dishes, and stories were exchanged about the ways the past year had changed them all. Mrs. Bennett, who'd sold her lake house to help save Mr. Davidson, proudly showed off pictures of the community garden she'd started instead. A different kind of retirement dream, she said, but a better one. As the sun began to set, Rachel found herself back beside Alice's bicycle. Emma joined her, followed by Katie, Mr. Davidson, and David. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the community they'd helped rebuild celebrate around them. "You know what I think?" Emma said finally, running her hand along the bicycle's handlebars. "I think Grandma Alice knew. Somehow she knew that her bicycle would matter, that it would bring people together. That's why she made Grandpa promise to keep it." Rachel thought about the letter in the shed, about Alice's words regarding second chances. She thought about how a single choice to stop and help had rippled outward, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined. She thought about her own journey from grief to healing, about Katie's growth, about Emma's transformation from a scared young girl to a confident young woman with a purpose. "Some things are meant to be broken," Rachel said softly, "so we can learn how to fix them together." As if in response, a gentle breeze rustled through the park, making the streamers on Alice's bicycle dance. In that moment, Rachel felt with absolute certainty that some kinds of repair work never truly ended. It just changed shape, transformed into new possibilities, new connections, new ways of healing. The story of a single mother fixing a neighbor's bicycle had become something larger, a testament to the power of community, to the strength found in helping others, to the endless possibilities that open up when we choose to stop and help fix what's broken. In Cedar Grove, that legacy would continue, one repair at a time, one life at a time, one miracle at a time. 5 years later. The bell above the door of Davidson and Collins Vintage Restorations chimed as Rachel finished polishing the handlebars of a newly restored vintage Schwinn. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, catching the silver lettering on the wall that read, "Every broken thing deserves a second chance." Words borrowed from Alice's letter that had become the shop's motto. Emma, now 17 and tall like her grandmother, entered wearing her shop apprentice teaching uniform. Her tool belt jingled as she walked, each tool a testament to years of dedication to her craft. "The new class is starting today," she announced, excitement clear in her voice. Behind her, Katie followed with a stack of training manuals they'd developed together. The shop had grown considerably. What started as a single workspace had expanded to occupy the entire building. One section remained dedicated to restoration work, another to the Rehabilitation Center's therapy program, and a third served as a training facility for young apprentices. Alice's blue bicycle still held its place of honor, though now it was surrounded by photographs, a visual timeline of lives transformed through the simple act of repair. Mr. Davidson, now fully recovered and more vibrant than ever, spent his mornings teaching gardening at the community center and his afternoons sharing stories with rehabilitation center participants as they worked on their bikes. His son, David, had become one of the most respected rehabilitation counselors in the state, his program replicated in facilities across the country. Rachel watched through the window as a new group of apprentices gathered outside, teenagers from all walks of life, each carrying their own stories of things that needed fixing. Mrs. Bennett, her hair now fully silver but her energy unchanged, was already there, greeting them with her famous homemade cookies and wisdom. "Mom," Katie called from the workbench, now 19 and helping run the shop's administrative side between college classes. "Look what I found in the old files." She held up a newspaper clipping, the original article about their first fundraiser for Mr. Davidson. The paper had yellowed with age, but the story it told remained as powerful as ever. As Rachel held the article, she remembered Alice's words about the magic of second chances. She thought about all the lives that had been touched since that morning she'd stopped to help fix a bicycle. Hundreds of restored bikes, dozens of recovered addicts, countless young people who'd found purpose in learning the art of repair. The shop's latest edition hung near the entrance, a large map dotted with pins showing all the places their restored bicycles had traveled, all the communities that had started their own repair programs inspired by their story. Each pin represented another ripple in the wave of kindness that had started with one simple choice. Cedar Grove had become known as the town that fixes things. Not just bicycles, but lives, hopes, and dreams. The Alice Davidson Scholarship Fund had helped over 50 young people learn the trade, each one carrying forward the legacy of the woman who believed in the power of repair. As the new class filed in, Rachel caught a glimpse of her reflection in a polished fender, a woman who had found her purpose in fixing not just what was broken, but in teaching others to do the same. She smiled, picking up her teaching toolkit, ready to show another group of eager learners that sometimes the most important repairs happen in the heart. Above them all, a gentle breeze stirred the wind chime Mr. Davidson had hung years ago, its soft music a reminder that some stories don't really end. They just keep spinning forward, like wheels on a newly restored bicycle, carrying hope into the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.